Welcome everybody to the World Livability Podcast Network. My name is Emily Gomer, and I'm a podcast engineer here. So I'm bringing another episode of Workability, which is part of Blue Collar Crypto. So they're here every Sunday at 4 and 5:30 p.m. Central. But with nothing further to do, pass over to Tim and Yell to take us away. So, what do you guys, what do we have on the agenda for today?
Yes, well, we're going to talk about a number of things. You're going to start with the ADA, American Disabilities Act. We'd like to interview Kurt Rothkopf and ask him about that, and then we're going to transition into the phone show.
All right, Neil. So how can I help you with the ADA? What would you like to know? What do you want to do with the
Here's
interview?
my understanding. It was started signed into law in 1991. Is that correct?
No, George H.W. Bush signed the ADA into law in 1990. So the
Okay.
1991 was more, kind of the beginnings of when you saw like everything change all around the country because of
Sure.
the year that it took to make everything happen. Yeah.
Uh-huh. How has the ADA impacted the average person with disabilities, and how has that ADA improved people's lives?
Well, there's quite an extensive answer available to that. And the reason I say that is that in 2014, the ADA Legacy Project, adalegacy.org, so the National ADA Network created in concert with and inspired by Americans with Disabilities to run a blog that answered that very question. So the idea is this blog that was done for a year leading up to the Americans with Disabilities Act celebrations. So pretty much it was announced at the 24th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then it was that Americans with Disabilities populated the blog with their own personal answer for how, as an American with a disability, did the ADA affect them personally. So if only one person responded to the blog on a day, and then that happened every day, that'd be 365 answers. But, there were thousands upon thousands of responses throughout that year. And the other point of that blog was to create an advocacy message that they wanted to tie along with that, and they did with the ADA Legacy Project to make a large statement about how the lives of people with disabilities are every day, which someone like me, I really took that to heart because like part of my story is helping with adaptive water skiing. And I was coming into it being with the Pewauk Lake Water Ski Club, and we had a decade ago, and we still have the annual event, but that pretty much was the only thing I was doing really as an ongoing effort with the disability community. So it really wound me up to be like, instead of hanging on to your laurels and just being like, oh, I do great things in the disability community, now and again, few and far between, throughout a year or even longer, maybe, um, that we can really ask ourselves, what are we doing today already? What are we doing now? What are we doing later, with Americans with disabilities? And on the other side, what are people with disabilities doing? Which is not as much of a question or challenge, but to look at the relationship both ways between folks that don't identify them as an American with a disability and those that do identify as an American with a disability. But for sure, it's all about access. I mean, I tell the story about how in the 80s and in 1989, getting the adoption of the act, getting it passed in Congress, the thing that happened with the congressional leaders is people would talk to them and say, hey, you send veteran, you send military over to fight your wars, and then they come back injured, they come back with a disability, and then they can't get into your office. So in terms of access of ramps and elevators and stuff like that. So that's really the big play. And the idea is along with that, we got the message that as much as it was inspired and a cry and a demand by Americans with Disabilities, it benefited all of us because we all use elevators. We all, walk up the ramp, we all tend to do that thing. So we benefit from the accommodations of ADA, whether or not we have a disability. And then we should look at it that if we're helping people with disabilities participate in what we're doing, that we're getting that added benefit that way because that person is coming into the same space as we are. Right.
Great. Tim, did you have any questions, or do you want me to ask my next question?
No, not really. I had to add on to what Kurt said. We do better if just the disabled are part of our economy. The economy does better. Just looking at it from a cold, hard economic standpoint, if people with disabilities get employment, now that's a different subject, but in the employment part, the piece of disabled people's experience, if they're getting employment, it helps our economy. It means more of us are involved using dollars, using the currency, working for a living, earning for ourselves, does wonders for self-esteem to say that you have a job. I think all of us here feel the same way. We all feel that working is fundamental. And then, so yeah, from an economic standpoint, the Disabilities Act was either, was part of or the beginning of the employment part of the disabled experience. Yeah.
My next question involves what was, life before the American Disabilities Act was very different for people with disabilities. There wasn't the broad safety net available. What would people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Helen Keller, what would their lives be different if they had access to the ADA?
Well, again, it's all about, mobility, accessibility. Like when you're bringing up about Helen Keller and the use of Braille and, other accommodations for the deafblind community. Helen Keller's struggle is like, say, like with Lions International. That's the big story is Helen Keller succeeded in appealing to Lions International to adopt the interests of largely the blind community. I mean, she was a big deafblind advocate. But in terms of the issues of people with blindness, the whole vision aspect, the Lions picked that up. And that's because the deaf and blind community and the deaf blind, people are both deaf and blind, really found themselves isolated. So that's the issue is, lack of opportunity. Now you brought up about a president. So you're with that example, well, and then Helen Keller was a successful advocate and public figure. So you're not thinking that it's about opportunity, but it really is about that because that's really why they became, role models in the disability community because, Americans with disabilities looked at them and basically said that they want to have, similar opportunity to FDR and Helen Keller. And at the same time, the way the country operates, it statistically would be, they call it disproportionately less likely that we put Americans with disabilities, in a path that when they look at their counterparts who don't identify as American disabilities, that is, like 100 times easier, in most cases for people who don't have a disability as compared to a disability. But that's a stereotype too. So it's overgeneralized, but it at least still depicts the issue, because that is a statistical reality that we need to address. And the other thing to realize is that, America, the USA is hypocritical because there's a lot of political statements and, things in agency or in laws that are about people with disabilities working. Yes, yet there are, income penalties. There are penalties for Americans with disabilities working too much. So that becomes a need that we need to address is, do we really want Americans with disabilities to work like we do? Or are we just kind of enslaving them? Is it more of a slavery to say that we just think it's better for our laws and our government to say, well, if you work this amount, well, then they don't need Medicare, Medicaid, and then what we do is we hold their medical security over their head, and they become afraid to work. So that's something to address. It's a little bit outside of ADA, but ADA does have some mandates that, do affect the workplace, like in terms of web content accessibility guidelines and, use of assistive technology, so on and so forth. And another thing that people aren't as familiar with, and I know I wasn't either until I learned about it 10 years ago, is that when you visit, like, say, federally funded programs and buildings of these disability programs, like independent living centers, when you go to those events, they'll put right in the invite, please don't wear cologne or perfume, because of chemical sensitivity. So that's an issue as well. And then plus in technology, you have the issue of like smart home and such like that we're using Bluetooth and all the signaling and everything. And there's people with EMF sensitivity, the electromagnetic fields from our technology, that there's a lot of people who cannot withstand that, and they can't be in a space where there's all this technology putting all that pollution in the air, that EMF pollution, that affects them as well. So these are things protected by the ADA, and most people are not aware. And so that's a big area of need for awareness, that people are aware of. The general gist of ADA is protect people who have difficulty participating in public events and publicly provided resources, and be able to get into the buildings and to be at events and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, great. Now I talked recently about Jim Braddock, the boxer who broke his hand and had to go on public relief. And, therefore, public relief is similar to claiming disability. Is he a rarity? Is the average person with disabilities able to do that, or is he a rarity?
Wait, when you say, I'm trying to recall what your point was. So the public relief, I'm not quite getting how to answer your question.
Okay, so in the 30s, in the 30s, they didn't call it welfare; they called it public relief. And he broke his hand and was not able to box, so he had to claim help. And like the average person today on disability has to claim help. Very few people today go off disability once they're on it because of the need for it. Is he a rarity in that he was able to heal his hand through working on the docks, and then was able to return to fighting, and actually paid back his loan from the welfare office or the relief office? Is that a rarity today? Because I know one individual who is currently is quadriplegic and he works full time as an engineer. And I really believe that, is it possible to do that, or is that a rarity for someone like the Jim Braddocks of the world be able to do that?
Yeah, I see your point now. Yeah, that'd be true. It is more of a rarity. That this falls into what I was saying is that, when we don't live the life of a disability every day, we have no relationship with the fact of, what it is to try to build your independence from work or through work, and to make sure that you're not going backwards in terms of your medical needs and so forth. So yes, it's absolutely true that as much as it functionally is there in the law that someone can transition through work to get off of the public assistance, to get off of, SSDI or all the things, the way it realistically plays out for most all people with disabilities, it's just not realistic. The way a caseworker recognize, short-term income and then create a long-term shift proposally, people talk about like, well, if you get off of the assistance and then you need to get back on, that's all there. But the reality is that it's not instantaneous enough for it to be practical. Because if you're
Correct.
used to going on medical appointments, on regularity, and then you have a disruption from that, that, like the, pain of change, does not justify the pain of, just staying in the pain of staying the same, which staying the
Right.
same would be stay on your benefits. So that's
Correct.
where we have a need in our bureaucracy, in our Congress, in our presidential leadership, at all levels. We need to continue to evolve, legislation and, how everything works in our country to get more sophisticated, because we do have this need to build up a more robust workforce. And the way that we are missing the mark with our American Disabilities Act is a big Achilles heel, for the United
Uh,
States of America, with all of its prestige and everything. It's something that we're just grossly underachieving in that area.
okay.
Exactly to your
Okay.
point.
Sure. That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
You are very welcome.
Has this stirred up any thoughts from you, Tim, in this whole conversation?
Well, just to piggyback on what Kurt said, because, to live on a disability check is to live in poverty. So now we have to address the issue of poverty. It's nearly impossible to make all your medical appointments, pay your rent, sufficiently eat, nutritious diet on a disabled paycheck. Now, do I have a solution? Absolutely not. I don't know how disabled people get off of poverty, but it becomes an issue because the Disabilities Act is not perfect, and there needs to be probably some way of figuring out how these people, maybe 4% of us in the country, 5% that live on disability checks, how do we get those people out of a sense of a poverty mindset, a poverty existence, lifestyle? How do we not make a disability person a poverty person? How do we make it not an issue? How do we fix that? Can we offer people more money? Can we increase the checks? The dollar amount. It doesn't keep up with inflation. You know, these disability checks do not keep up with inflation in the economy. How about that? Does because a person disabled make them automatically a poverty existence? So that's my question. Is that fair? You know? So do most people understand that we're not paying people a livable wage to be disabled? But there's ethical and moral questions, you know, to that. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, Tim, well said, because that's a little bit of what I was driving at with that we as Americans need to talk about this. One of my mantras is that, if we're not praying together and playing together, how do you expect that we're going to do any good working together? So, Neil, I know your passion is just through American disabilities being more highly informed and maybe building some private sector support systems that we could just use, the laws and the system as is and help people make that shift, which I think is shared by, just a lot of, a good percentage in our country, is working on that exact notion. And at the same time, to Tim's point, that we still do carry this very disparaging characteristic that I identify with. Because until I dove in, I'm 53 now, and my story is about how until I got into my 40s, I was completely ass backwards, type of deal in how I thought of most everything in this. And it took me getting with the ADA centers and the independent living centers and the advocacy groups and all the stuff, to really have an awakening and a transformation as someone who does not identify with a disability to say, I'm causing some of the barriers that exist in our country. So that's where I became passionate to pursue ability ministry, to volunteer with nonprofits that serve people with disabilities, to learn more about how accommodations work in education, to think about in our government. We have disability services in government, but how does the highway department and the park department and all the other works of government, how well do they deploy what government does for our patrons and citizens with disabilities? And then in the work realm, to really look at that, we do need to, take a look at how being more involved with each other, people with disabilities and people that don't have a disability in our churches, our community groups, at our libraries and in all things we do throughout the day, all the fun things. Like I talked about water skiing, and I used to be in the golf industry, and there's a way to help people with disabilities enjoy golf and outdoors, like with action track chairs. And just look at everything you do throughout your days and ask yourself, how am I doing helping make sure that the thing I'm doing and just did or planning to do, how does that work for someone with a disability? And how can I encourage everybody that I do it with to make it better for people with disabilities? See, and that practice, that habit, that commitment, that can show itself in the workplace. And then when we evolve to that point, it ought to expose more and more how we don't have the legislation and the laws against income by American Disabilities Act, how that's not anywhere close to where it needs to be, in large part due to Tim's point. We're very satisfied to say, oh, it's unfortunate you have a disability. Life is just not going to go as good for you. You're a person with a disability, and thanks to me, you're getting some help. No, but we're interdependent. People who, like myself, I didn't realize how much I needed people with disabilities. My life improved out of opening my life up entirely to the disability community. And so that becomes the great news out of all this, is that we can change our mentality, and people with disabilities don't have to be viewed as a liability. People with disabilities are a huge asset. So Americans with disabilities are the masters of ability, and we got to start putting that to practice, to your point, Neil, in the workplace as well.
Great. That'd be great. Yes, I agree.
So where do we go from here? Anything else
Well,
you
I
want to
think it's,
cover with the ADA?
no,
or
I
are we
think
at
we had about half an hour, and that's usually what we allow for the show, and I think we should probably wrap it up.
Very good. All right. Thank you so much,
Good.
gentlemen. This has been
Good job.
another amazing episode here of Workability. We definitely appreciate all the things from Neil Weber, Tim Trosian, and Kurt Roskoff here today. We are here every Sunday at 5:30 p.m. Central for Workability. We look forward to our next episode next Sunday. And as always, we thank you.